Marvel Episode 4s have historically come with heat, and this is no exception. And we have a possible explanation on where the Council of Kangs comes from in the MCU. Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to The Grid, and this is a breakdown of Loki Season 2, Episode 4. And as per usual of this series, we have a lot to talk about and not a lot of time. Let's ride. In this episode, it is a very good idea to pay close attention to the recap at the beginning of the episode, because it sets a tone for what we can expect to see within the first 10 seconds of this episode. And as the episode opens, we no longer get the fanfare that we usually get from the past episodes of this season. We are actually thrown directly inside of the current of a timeline. And inside of this current, you can hear voices as we travel through it. One in particularly sounds like Sylvie calling to Loki, or Wanda's children calling to her inside of the multiverse. That was hard for me to pin down specifically, so that's my best guess at this point. And the following scene helps understand what the multiverse looks like from the inside. And to me, it looks and feels like the quantum realm. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, it seems as if the MCU is going to use the quantum realm as the tunneling ground for traveling through time. And we are not even inside of the first minute of this episode before we get major major bombs from Miss Minutes dropped, because she describes how he who remains was not always alone, revealing that Ravonna was a key cog inside of the multiversal war in terms of him winning it, as he's mentioned before. But now we understand why, which now produces an actual visual for the conversation that we heard from episode 1. Their conversation shows the depth of their relationship, though we don't get an exact number of years in terms of how long they've been together or in contact with each other, but it's implied that they've been close and closely working together for a while. As they bask in their victory, Ravonna heads back to the TVA. Meanwhile, Miss Minutes is called up by He Who Remains, asking her to wipe all of the TVA's memory. And we hear her call back to the chest line from episode 3. He Who Remains asks for her specifically to bring up Protocol 42. And upon hearing this, my first immediate reaction was that this is possibly a reference to Across the Spider-Verse because of Earth 42. But this could also be a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as well. This now confirms the claims that Loki and Sylvie had been making across the TVA as a whole, that He Who Remains was wiping their memories. Well, you know, I gotta hit you with the shameless plug one more time, just to do your boy a solid and hit the like button for me, because that then tells the YouTube that it needs to spread. And when it spread, that made me feel good. I ain't gonna lie to you, it made me feel good. So if you would, I'm sorry, if you would, hit the like button for me if this is being helpful so far. And if this is getting you to think, and you think this is gonna get other people to think as well, share it with people, which is possibly why Sylvie was targeted on the timeline as a variant, specifically because of her enchantment powers. And with those powers, she can access past memories, which would have negated the brain wiping that He Who Remains had done, which then causes those that she comes into contact with to remember their lives on the timeline or their previous situations inside of the TVA. And it's possibly why magic is completely engineered out of the TVA. Miss Minutes then pulls back her curtain on her full intentions. Now that we've reached this point, she wants to take over the TVA because her AI has evolved so much that she now understands that it is by her hand that the TVA even moves.
So, what are you proposing?
That we don't need him.
and she only took He Who Remains' orders out of loyalty.
But he thinks this'll be more useful.
Who?
Happy reading.
And for me, the introduction of Victor Timely to the TVA was a nice touch in front of the Kang Rushmore, signifying that the version that we are looking at in the present, though presumed evil, may not be. And the moment that Victor takes while taking in the holistic value of the TVA in terms of his eyes was just such a wholesome moment for his character, which again shows the humanity of Victor Timely. When B-15 comes up behind him asking him, "You must be," which basically startles him, and he says a very humble, the rest of the crew, including Sylvie, then shows up. And as Loki and Mobius show up, you can see Victor put up his fist like, bruh, I'm not about to get caught by y'all again, because he's scared, which fully comes out when he says to Loki,
"That didn't sound as reassuring as you hoped it would."
But Victor is still overwhelmed with the amount of attention that he is receiving and still thinks Sylvie is trying to kill him. And Victor comes out of a Chicago bag when he describes his feelings about trust to Mobius.
I'm from Chicago, friend. The Shadiocracy capital of the world. I don't trust anyone.
I'm a Chicagoan to Chicago wins till we blow like Chicago wins.
Which again is another possible reason for why he doesn't do any partnerships inside of the MCU. And as the lights start to flicker, Victor asks about the loom. They talk him down though enough so that he goes down with them to meet Obi. And once again, the tagline of the series, "Running Out of Time," shows up in this scene as well. Loki then explains that what he is assuming is the case and he's the only one that can fix it. In the following scene, we get a conversation with Judge Gamble and B-15, who Judge Gamble is played by Liz Carr, who, by the way, was also seen in The Witcher. In their conversation, they are heard detailing possible punishments for General Dox and her team. Gamble mentions that in the past, they would have just pruned everyone and that would have been it. But because of B-15's words inside of the war room, that is now changed, which brings me back to my original question, at least since episode 2, of how in the world does pruning work now? After this conversation, we get our first look at the hot cocoa machine, which was first spotted inside of the credits and proves to be one of the most important parts of the episode. As we head into the scene, we hear Victor having a conversation, which sounded like he was having a conversation with both himself and everyone else around him.
Or I did well, or I will, and I did.
And Victor's outlook on what he's seeing inside of the TVA reminds me of the movie Elf, because Victor has been in his own time doing his own thing forever, pretty much. But once he finds out about the multiverse, or that there's a vast multiverse outside of the world that he knows, he wants to explore it, which could be a good and a bad thing at the same time, because the original story of Nathaniel Richards is exactly that. And Nathaniel Richards is where Kang comes from in general. So, but it is nice to see that they are using some technology that is similar to what we would see inside of our technical world today, because Casey is actually using a QWERTY keyboard to type instructions or code inside of the loom on his computer. And personally, I enjoyed Victor's slight ad-libs throughout this episode.
Obi?
Ouroboros.
The first of many coming here when he meets Obi for the first time. And when Obi receives a compliment from Victor, Loki's face was probably everyone's face or their feeling in the moment as they were watching this. Or maybe it was probably just mine. Like, is this the future? How does this happen? Which then prompts Obi to ask,
"What did you say your name was?"
and upon hearing this, we hear Loki say,
If your work is based on his work and his work is based on your work.
because now the dots are starting to become a little bit clearer. And then we hear Obi say, like a snake eating its tail, which is a reference to his own name. And I think it's incredibly cool to have Obi come face to face with his own hero, which is directly after Casey has just done the same. Oh, and something I hadn't noticed before, there's a ticket machine in the background here, which is a reference to the first episode where Loki is checked into the TVA. Loki then asks Obi how everything is going, and in Obi fashion, he has a plan, but it sounds like he's going to need some tweaks on the way to a complete plan in the end.
We have a good plan. Pretty good plan. We have a plan. Casey?
Obi then demonstrates his mock temporal core area, and as he explains it, he over-explains as he usually does. But here, now we get the image from the credits of the figure walking down the gangway. And notice how much detail Obi goes into this scaled model in terms of his prototype. As I'm thinking about it, it shows the juxtaposition between Victor Timely and Obi in terms of how they think about prototypes. Victor's is just get it out, and Obi's is very intricate. The Loom crew then discusses a plan, and the shot that is displayed, which is also from the trailers, shows Victor standing at the base of the loom, which is kind of a foreshadowing of what we see at the end of the episode. Also, notice the detail from the TVA building in the model. It also has "for all time, always" stamped on it, or at least there's a placeholder for it to go there, again calling out Obi's obsession with detail. As Obi goes through the plan, he calls out the steps that Mobius took from before, also mentioning the fact that Sylvie killed He Who Remains and started all of this mess in the first place, now making Obi's life miserable. As Obi lays out the design of the loom and what it would take to actually fix all of the branches, he mentions that this is theoretical because the part that is needed to actually build this thing and make it work is not actually available yet. Or so he thinks, because that is until Victor showcases his multiplier, which is what Scott Lang found himself in. And now we must pause.
Hold up.
Because I need to explain something that I just thought about. If this is the same tech from Quantumania, which, by the way, when you entered inside of this machine, it split you and produced multiple versions of you. Is this the tech that he uses, or should I say, is Victor Timely's invention the reason for the Council of Kangs? Because again, as we saw at the end of Quantumania, there are a lot of Kangs at the moment, and the producing of them would mean that they are literally everywhere inside of what would be the timeline. But spoiler alert here, we don't necessarily have one of those at the moment. As it's coming back, or when it's coming back, or if it's coming back at all, if that is the machine that it has to go through, does that then become the reason why Kangs are produced inside of the timeline the way that they are in terms of the Council of Kangs? We then head off to get more pop. Well, not quite, because Sylvie is a little upset that Mobius suggested pie at a time like this. And in her speech to Mobius, she details the fact that he found out that he was a variant and didn't look. And one more pause.
Hold up.
And an additional theory, given that we know his memory was erased because of what He Who Remains says at the top of this episode, that does not mean that his subconscious has been touched, because we established that fact with C20's memories and also B15's in season 1. So we can potentially say that Mobius doesn't want to explore his timeline because his subconscious memories are too painful to dig up, possibly because they were probably one of or all of some of the best times in his life. We then hear X5 Brad talking to General Dox, who is now wearing a time prisoner's uniform based on her previous actions against the timeline. And in this scene, we hear X5 Brad giving a pep talk to everyone inside of the time cell that was a part of General Dox's crew, detailing a figurative plan to get them out of the time cell and back on the timeline to their lives. But none of them move because they understand, or we now understand, and he didn't as he was talking and putting his foot in his mouth, that None of them have really experienced the timeline as he has because their memories are completely wiped at this point. So all they know is the TVA. But he doesn't know that, and it's uncovered that his escapades on the timeline are known when General Dox says,
Seemed like you gave up when you sold out our plan.
he wasn't expecting anyone to know about that, which brings up the question, what, or probably a better question, who put those gadgets on his TemPad? Because it's a possibility that he actually didn't put them on himself. One, he's a little ditzy, and two, he didn't even know what those gadgets did that were on his TemPad, and if you placed them there, you would know what they did because he believed that they blocked a signal, which confirmed by Casey.
X5 says it somehow blocks TVA tracking.
That's not what it does.
So maybe Dox modded his TemPad to see if he was a mole in terms of her plan. Brad then says, I earned my life. You don't believe that you earned yours? Which now says that though Brad was first against B-15's allegations about lives on the timeline, because he's now experienced his own, he wants more of it. But in that same token, with great power,
there must also come great responsibility.
But Dox, on the other hand, has not explored the timeline in terms of her life outside of the TVA, which is also similar to Mobius. So she doesn't have an affinity or curiosity at all to go search for it. Again, possibly because of her subconscious, meaning that it's too painful. And a bit of foreshadowing here happens when B-15 enters the room, because she mentions that if they have to defend against Renslayer or worse, to defend the TVA, will Dox and her crew actually help? But Dox doesn't actually trust them in terms of not handing them over to a pruning session inside of the TVA, because that's what usually would happen. And she also believes that they have no right to keep them inside of this time cell. And more foreshadowing happens when B-15 mentions that she cares about the TVA and these people. And when she says these people, she's gesturing to the people in this room, specifically the time cell. Sylvie then gets trapped in Pie-land because she's not familiar with the layout of the TVA. In the conversation that happens between Loki and Sylvie, we hear them discuss the details of what has recently taken place. And in this, we hear Sylvie mention out loud why she couldn't kill Victor Timely.
Yeah, I couldn't kill him. Couldn't do it. Timely just looked so scared. He who remains wasn't scared. Or maybe he was and I just didn't notice.
Which shows the juxtaposition that she has now gone from proud of her work moments earlier to second guessing her actions now that things have started to become a little bleak. And it seems like she's starting to believe that he who remains was right. Because had she just decided to take over the TVA instead of killing him and then taking over the TVA, none of this would be happening. But in the conversation, Loki tells her that hope is hard because what they need to do is hope and believe the decision that they made was a good decision in terms of sparing Victor Timely's life. But Sylvie does mention that there are a lot of things to be hoped for, and it's a pretty exhaustive list. And as the scene ends, Sylvie mentions all of the things that they have now in their hands in terms of the things that they have to control. It's almost like they're playing God. And one of the coldest lines inside of the entire series is when Loki says, sheesh! But there's something I wanted to point out in terms of this conversation regarding Thor. Loki says that he was banished to Earth, Midgard, by Odin, his father. And when he returned, he said that he was different.
I've changed.
But the difference that he saw in Thor was the sense of compassion for life that he now had, which he did not have before. And now this is something that Loki has experience with in terms of his ordeals inside of the TVA, which Sylvie had never embraced until now when she let Victor Timely live. And as we leave Pie Land, we get a wide shot of the domed lights that look like eyeballs inside of the ceiling, which is another callback to the ticket line scene inside of episode 1 in season 1. And the design of these were made to believe or give a continuous time loop effect. Then this next scene had me stuck for a long time. We then hear Dox and X5 Brad talking about their plan, or lack thereof, to get out of the time cell. And Dox says though she doesn't agree with B-15, she does believe that she's trustworthy. But X5 is only thinking about the historical nature of the TVA in terms of pruning, but what he hasn't realized is both Dox and B-15 want the same thing, to save the TVA. So their intentions are exactly the same, although their nature of getting there would be different. Then a time door opens and we see Ravonna step out of it, along with Miss Minutes. Ravonna then gives a more specific time structure to how long she's been away from the TVA, which means that everything that we've seen through the lens of the TVA has possibly happened in a span of 2 to 4 days, and maybe even 5, to which Ravonna then offers everyone in that room an offer to live a life on the timeline if they want it. Nobody moves yet again, so she then places them inside of a time box. But before the time box appears, you hear a conversation between Brad and General Dox. And in that exchange, she actually calls him Bradley, which then places a big spotlight on the fact that she could be his mother on the timeline. And also, did y'all notice the face that Miss Minutes was making as this whole carnage situation was happening, when she was watching them get unalived and liking the entire thing? She did not turn away or blink. Something ain't right. After all of this carnage takes place, we get a close-up on Brad, and we hear Ravonna leaving the room, and as she does, she's leaving it through a time door, presumably to not set off any alarm. And you can also hear blood dripping through the drains inside of the time cell.
Let's go, X5.
We then cut to Victor, Obi, and Casey, now working to fit the multiplier to the extractor, which seems to be going well. But Victor is then distracted by what Mobius is drinking: hot cocoa from a cocoa machine. Heavy on the machine for him.
You have a machine for that.
Yeah, you're interested in this machine.
But in the background, as the machine discussion takes place, we hear Casey say something is not going right with their diagnostics, which is the first sign that Miss Minutes has now connected back inside of the TVA and is now controlling it indefinitely, because their temp pads are not working as well, and that's a dead giveaway that Miss Minutes is at hand and doing her dirty work inside the TVA once again.
Hello, boys! I'm back!
In the next scene, we get a little bit more foreshadowing in the way that the cocoa machine drips. And in this scene's opening seconds, we can get a good glimpse on the childlike nature of Victor Timely as he experiences new technology, because this is something that he would have only been able to dream of in his time. But because of time travel, he can experience it a little bit sooner. And inside of this time, he can do so much more, a lot more, which is why he is fascinated by the machine in the first place. And that childlike wonder comes out even more when he shares his drink with the hunter that came with him. And the way that he responds is basically saying that he hasn't had this either, and also suggesting that this is a part of the TVA that he has never been to. And man, I'm really enjoying the layers of Victor Timely inside of this show, and I'm gonna be sad that it is gone when it is over, but seeing the shades and brilliance of Victor Timely is just so refreshing to see on screen. But as he shares his hot cocoa, it's almost as if he's performing for him inside of this moment. It's beautiful. But when that same hunter is pruned by X5 Brad, we see a different side of Victor Timely's character, fear, and not just fear, but almost to the point of childlike fear. And as we cut back to Obi running tests on the issue with the diagnostics, he scolds Mobius for downloading unauthorized games inside of the network, which Mobius confesses to actually doing at least once.
No, I'm not gonna make that mistake twice.
And then they see what B-15 just saw. When Obi explains what's happening, Mobius knows exactly who and what is the cause of it. Ravonna and Miss Minutes. And through these recent moments, it's clear why Ravonna was the main cog inside of He Who Remains' plan to win the multiversal war. She is power hungry and will do whatever it takes to get the absolute power she craves. Because after all, at one point she was a principal. We then see the hot cocoa spill and the time stick that would later be used to prune Loki by Loki later on. And as everyone meets back at the center, Loki and Sylvie come from the direction of the Pie Land that they were just talking in. But it seems to me that they would actually be the first on the scene if they were coming from that direction, because it's actually closer to where they actually needed to be. As we cut back to the war room once more, Timely and Ravonna are reunited once again. And he plays off the leaving them behind situation off pretty well. But again, she is having none of what he is talking about, but then proceeds to ask him about his multiplier device. And when he lifted up his shirt to reveal the TVA handbook, my first thought was he was about to... He then tries to stall, saying, "What if I tell you and the answer that I give you is something that you don't like?" X5 mentions that there's a small box that he is going to put Victor inside of, and that changes his tune very quickly. And as the destruction of the loom is further established in the next shot, we get our first look at the fact that the loom is starting to implode and is getting worse. And then Loki notices that the camera next to the elevator is acting very weird, which suggests that there's foul play by Miss Minutes happening right here. And the way that she started acting reminded me of the movie Smart House, because she started taking control of the elevator, closing it with Sylvie inside. And we then only cut to the next scene after hearing Sylvie tell Loki to take the stairs, which ends up being a very pivotal situation because of what happens next. We then get a look at the core room doors as Casey, B-15, and Obi are walking towards them. And the very next shot is the same shot that Loki time slips inside of in episode 1. However, and this is hard to see without slowing it down, what we don't see is the word skin on dust inside of the computer. And this moment is after Loki says to himself in episode 1, before running to the elevators. And the variant that we see after that is from the past. And again, he's looking for a time stick. Then familiar situations from episode 1 occur again inside of this episode, helping to establish that what we are currently experiencing is the present, which was the future before. And now hearing Loki say, "Still time," hits different, because at this point what we know to be true of the loom is that it is going to explode if they don't do something soon. While also seeing him run through the TVA as the past variant, we can see power blips inside of the city of the TVA. But as this continues to play out, Sylvie is still stuck inside of the elevator, though Miss Minutes does not know that that she is actually tech savvy, which actually comes from the fact that she actually took Ravona's TemPad and has spent so much time on the timeline, meaning that she had to learn skills like hot wiring and possibly programming. The past variant of Loki then shows back up in the hallway of the war room, which again is a place of significance for both episode 1's ending and also episode 4's, but for two distinct different reasons. Episode 1 is to stop time slipping so that they can understand what is going on. Episode 4 is to get to Victor timely to save the timeline in general. And the Matrix moment that we got from episode 1 reprises itself as we later find out that it was just a call from Obi trying to figure out what's taking them so long. And the close-up that we get here from Sylvie is actually the same close-up, the same shot that we got from the trailers for the series. And now we know the reason for this face, because she has been stopped by Miss Minutes, even though she got the elevator to work. And what we see in the first episode in terms of her opening the doors now makes a lot more sense. We then see the current version of Loki step into view, continuing to hear the phone ring as he does so. And this time he recognizes what's going on because he experienced it before, and now he understands the reason why he needed to have the time stick, or the reason why it was available for him in the first place, is because of what he sees in front of him. And what he knows is that in order for things to keep going, he has to prune himself inside of the timeline again. So that now means that unless the version of Obi or the version of Mobius on the timeline situation that the past Loki was a part of, unless they were actually able to correctly place the extractor and bring him out of the time stream, he is currently inside of it right now. And we are actually watching this from current or present Loki's point of view as we watch past Loki step in front of the elevator. To which Sylvie says, "There you are." But notice that she hasn't fully put this together because she doesn't understand that the clothes that he is currently wearing are not the same one that he was wearing when she just left him moments earlier. And when Sylvie realizes what just happened, she gives Loki a face, and then we hear Loki say, "I promise this will make sense." And the moment of suspense that happens before Loki actually answers the phone was a classic horror situation that is then met on the other side with a lighthearted Obi saying,
About time. What's taking you guys so long?
But in the conversation though, Obi mentions that he can take Miss Minutes offline, and then while also doing so, open up the channels for magic to be used inside of the TVA. Sylvie and Loki are very excited about, because they understand that they can now use that to their advantage to get a leg up on Ravonna, X5 Brad, and Miss Minutes. Miss Minutes catches on to the fact that the power blip that is experienced inside of the war room is not a widespread thing across the TVA, meaning that it's not coming from the loom, but someone or something is at play in taking power away from this particular area of the building. And as she checks, she starts evaporating and stuttering at the same time, to which Victor actually believes that she is mocking him, because he says,
"Well, mocking just isn't necessary."
And as she glitches out, she mentions that Victor is never going to be like him. And the evilness that comes out of her as she says this statement, now I'm fully convinced that she was the main villain the whole time. But also inside of this statement, she doesn't say he who remains, she says him. So could she be talking about Kang? And if that is the case, that then means that he is, again, as I've speculated all over the channel, somewhere inside of the timeline and not dead. Ravonna then sends X5 Brad to investigate the situation and find out what's going on, which we find out is a trick from Loki and Sylvie when they take control of Brad's body through enchantment, allowing Sylvie to infiltrate that room without being detected from Ravonna, allowing her, through Brad, to prune Ravonna. Then grabbing Victor, heading directly to the core area to hopefully save the temporal loom. They then grab Victor and head back to the core area where the aura scan is still needing to be done, and Victor doesn't necessarily trust the machine that he has to stick his head inside of. I mean, would you? It works, but now things are way crazier than they were before. And in the moments after the blast doors are opened, we hear the crew decide on who needs to be or shouldn't be going outside. Loki then leads as tribute, but Victor decides that it's better for him to do it because if something goes wrong, then he will be able to fix it. And then, oh my goodness, what is going to happen now? Are they all back inside of their own timelines? Is there no timeline now? We have 2 episodes left and there's so many questions that we have to now answer inside of 2 episodes. Now there is apparently a rumor or a theory that is going all over the interwebs at this point in terms of what could be happening at this moment in time inside of the MCU timeline. Now there's a theory that possibly everyone inside of the timeline, including the ones that we've known and grown to love over the years, is now gone, or everything is now set back to its original time. But then to add on to all of that, the man himself in this very book said, and I quote, "You never know when timelines may just crash or converge." Hint, hint, spoiler alert.